The shaman hasn't slept in 2 days. That's not incidental, it's the point. The exhaustion is preparation, a deliberate thinning of the membrane between the ordinary world and whatever lies on the other side. He's been fasting too, and the fasting has made the smell coming from the clay bowl in front of him sharper than it should be, almost overwhelming, even though the liquid has barely been heated and the room is cold. The people behind him are quiet. Children were sent away an hour ago. He drinks. Not quickly, not reluctantly. With the particular deliberateness of someone who has done something frightening enough times that the fear has been alchemized into ritual. 30 minutes pass, maybe 40, and then something behind his eyes changes, not like a door opening, more like the walls of the room becoming less certain than they were. The people behind him watch his breathing change, watch his hands move in patterns that don't correspond to anything in the visible room. Someone near the back is holding their own breath without realizing it. What he's metabolizing right now is a chemical called dimethyltryptamine, brewed from 2 specific Amazonian plants whose individual properties are unremarkable, but whose combination produces something that should not, by any straightforward logic, be possible. He knows nothing about DMT or MAO inhibitors or the pharmacology of serotonin receptors. What he knows is that his grandfather drank this, and his grandfather's grandfather drank this, and the knowledge of which plants, in what ratio, prepared in what sequence, came from somewhere that none of them can fully account for. That somewhere is the actual subject of this video. The human relationship with psychoactive plants is old enough that the word old barely covers it. We're not talking about ancient civilizations. We're talking about a timeline that predates writing, predates agriculture, possibly predates anatomically modern humans as we currently define the category. And yet the standard cultural conversation about mind-altering plants treats them as essentially modern problems, or at best as exotic features of specific non-Western cultures, interesting but peripheral to the main story of how humanity developed. That framing is not just incomplete. It actively obscures one of the more significant and strange truths about how human consciousness developed and how human cultures organized themselves around experiences they couldn't explain. The first encounters with psychoactive plants weren't recreational experiments or spiritual luxury items. They were events, sometimes terrifying events, that forced groups of people to build entirely new cognitive and cultural frameworks from the ground up to contain what had happened to them. What this video is about is that construction process. How ancient humans stumbled into experiences that had no precedent, no map, and no off switch. What those encounters actually produced, neurologically, socially, culturally. How the resulting frameworks shaped religion, medicine, and political authority in ways that are still embedded in the structures we inhabit today. And why the most important thing about the ancient relationship with psychoactive plants is not the plants themselves, but the human response to contact with the genuinely incomprehensible. For threads to follow. First, the actual pharmacological landscape of the ancient world, what was available, and how people found it. Second, the neurological reality of what potent plant psychedelics do to a human brain and why that experience is so cognitively destabilizing. Third, the specific cultural technologies that different societies built to manage and contain encounters with these substances. And fourth, what the modern dismissal of these traditions costs us, what we lose when we flatten a complex epistemological history into a drug problem. The pharmacological resources available to ancient humans were considerably richer than most people's mental model of history allows. The Amazon basin alone contains thousands of plant species, and the indigenous pharmacological knowledge encoded in traditions like ayahuasca preparation, which combines the DMT-containing leaves of Psychotria viridis with the monoamine oxidase, inhibiting vine Banisteriopsis caapi, represents a level of botanical sophistication that remains genuinely difficult to explain. DMT is present in dozens of Amazonian plants, but it's orally inactive on its own. Stomach enzymes break it down before it reaches the bloodstream. Making it orally active requires combining it with an MAOI. Finding that combination among the thousands of available plants, and understanding that the combination is what matters rather than either plant individually, is the kind of discovery that shouldn't be stumbling distance from accidental. In the Andean highlands, mescaline-containing cacti, primarily San Pedro, Echinopsis paucanoi, have been in ceremonial use for at least 3,000 years based on archaeological evidence. and probably considerably longer. Residue analysis of ritual objects from the Chavan culture in Peru, dating to around 1000 BCE, shows clear evidence of San Pedro preparation. The Chavan sites themselves feature elaborate stone carvings of figures holding cactus sections, alongside imagery of jaguars, serpents, and hybrid human-animal beings. The specific visual vocabulary of mescaline visions in dozens of independently documented accounts. Across the Atlantic, Mesoamerican cultures developed ritual systems around psilocybin containing mushrooms, Tiananacatl and Nahuatl, literally flesh of the gods, that were documented in horrified detail by Spanish colonial clergy who correctly identified the mushrooms as central to indigenous religious practice and who worked systematically to suppress them for exactly that reason. The Aztec ritual use of these mushrooms was embedded in specific calendrical ceremonies, administered by trained specialists, and surrounded by elaborate preparatory and interpretive protocols. Further north, across the Great Plains of North America, peyote, the small, button-shaped mescaline cactus, appears in archaeological contexts dating back at least 5,000 years, with some estimates pushing considerably further. In Siberia, the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, appears in contexts suggesting ritual use among shamanic cultures, and some scholars have proposed it as a candidate for the mysterious soma of the Vedic texts, though that identification remains contested. The geographic spread is the important detail here. Every inhabited continent on Earth produced cultures that developed intentional relationships with specific psychoactive plants, surrounded those relationships with formal ritual and specialist knowledge, and embedded the resulting practices in their deepest religious and healing traditions. That level of convergence doesn't happen by accident. Something about the encounter with these substances was compelling enough and significant enough that cultures widely separated in space and time arrived at broadly similar responses. To understand why, you have to look at what potent plant psychedelics actually do to a brain, not in the moralizing sense, but in the neurological one, because the experience they produce is genuinely unlike anything else the human nervous system encounters in ordinary life, and that unusualness is precisely the point. The primary mechanism of classical psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, and LSD, though LSD is obviously modern, is agonism at the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. What that means in practice is a significant disruption of the default mode network, the brain's background operating system that maintains the ordinary sense of a bounded, continuous self located in a specific body moving through a specific world. The default mode network is what generates the experience of being you. The narrative continuity, the sense of separation between self and environment, the filtering mechanisms that prioritize familiar patterns and suppress unfamiliar ones. When the 5-HT2A receptor is activated at sufficient levels, the default mode network goes offline. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. And what happens when that network quiets is not chaos. It's a different kind of order. Sensory information that was being filtered out floods back in. Connections between brain regions that don't normally communicate directly start firing together. The sense of a bounded self becomes porous or dissolves entirely. Time loses its normal sequential structure. The specific content of what people experience under these conditions varies considerably by individual, by preparation, by set and setting. All the variables that research from people like Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins and Robin Carhart-Harris at UCSF has been carefully mapping in contemporary clinical contexts. But certain features recur with enough consistency across cultures, centuries, and chemical compounds to qualify as structural rather than idiosyncratic. Encounters with entities or presences that feel external and autonomous, geometric and architectural visual phenomena, a sense of profound meaningfulness attached to ordinary objects and perceptions, and experiences of ego dissolution that are described as simultaneously terrifying and revelatory. That last combination, terrifying and revelatory simultaneously, is the cognitive key to understanding why these substances generated such powerful cultural responses. The experience doesn't fit neatly into existing categories. It isn't pleasant in the way that warmth or satiation or mild intoxication is pleasant. It isn't painful in the way that injury is painful. It's closer to what the philosopher Rudolf Otto, writing in 1917, called the numinous, a category of experience characterized by what he termed the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that simultaneously terrifies and compels. Otto was describing religious experience in general. He might as well have been describing a well-prepared ayahuasca ceremony. When an experience is both terrifying and the most meaningful thing that has ever happened to you, your brain does not file it away as a curiosity. It reorganizes around it. The encounter becomes a reference point that everything else is measured against. And the culture around you, which needs to make functional sense of what just happened to you, because you are a member of a group that depends on shared reality frameworks to coordinate behavior, has to build something that can hold the weight of what you're describing. That building process is where religion comes from. Or at least, it's where a significant portion of religious experience and structure comes from, in the specific cultures where these encounters were central rather than peripheral. The cultural technologies built around psychoactive plant encounters are among the most elaborate and sophisticated knowledge systems that pre-literate cultures produced. Consider the structure of a classical Mazatec mushroom ceremony in southern Mexico, as documented extensively by ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson following his fieldwork in the 1950s, including his famous 1957 Life magazine article that introduced psilocybin mushrooms to mainstream Western awareness, triggering consequences that neither he nor anyone else anticipated. The ceremony, conducted by Maria Sabina, the Mazatec curandera who worked with Wasson, was not an unstructured experience. It was a precisely choreographed event with specific songs, prayers, and invocations that served a diagnostic and healing function. Sabina used the mushrooms as a diagnostic tool. The visions they produced, in her framework, revealed the source of a patient's illness and the appropriate treatment. The mushrooms were not recreational. They were clinical. The training required to conduct such a ceremony, to manage both your own experience and the experiences of others in the room, to maintain functional presence while in an altered state sufficient for genuine perceptual dissolution, to interpret the resulting visions through a culturally coherent framework, and to translate that interpretation into practical guidance for the person who came to you in need, took years, possibly decades. It was a legitimate specialty, demanding and dangerous, and the people who held it occupied a specific social role that carried both authority and responsibility. In South American ayahuasca traditions, the training of a curandero or ayahuasquero involves extended periods of dietary restriction called dietas, isolation, fasting from specific foods, sexual abstinence, alongside intensive apprenticeship with an experienced practitioner. The dieta is understood, within the tradition, as a period of forming a relationship with specific plant spirits. The plants teach. The practitioner learns. From outside the tradition, you can read this as an extended altered states experience combined with cognitive restructuring through social isolation and heightened neurological sensitivity. Both descriptions are pointing at the same process from different angles. What these cultural frameworks share is a recognition that the encounter with powerful psychoactive plants is too significant and too volatile to be left to individual navigation. It requires structure, preparatory structure, experiential structure, interpretive structure, and integrative structure afterward. The cultural container isn't window dressing around the pharmacology. The container is what makes the pharmacology useful rather than simply overwhelming. Here's where the story has to reckon with something uncomfortable, and it's worth doing it honestly rather than glossing past. The modern Western encounter with these substances, which began with Wasson's Life article, accelerated through the 1960s, and has undergone a significant second wave following the clinical research of the past 15 years, has repeatedly stripped the cultural container away from the pharmacological core and assumed that what remains is the essential thing. That's not obviously true, and the evidence suggests it causes real harm. Wasson's 1957 article, well-intentioned as it was, exposed Maria Sabina and her community to a wave of Western seekers that destabilized the social structure the ceremonies depended on. Sabina herself reportedly expressed deep regret about the exposure in later interviews, saying the mushrooms had lost their power once their use became widespread and culturally decontextualized. Whether you interpret that as mystical or pragmatic, whether the mushrooms literally lost potency, or whether the clinical and ceremonial framework that gave them their therapeutic function was simply overwhelmed by inappropriate use, The outcome was harm to a community and a tradition. The current clinical research on psilocybin and MDMA-assisted therapy is producing genuinely promising results for treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and end-of-life anxiety. Griffith's work, Carhart Harris's work, Michael Pollan's accessible synthesis of it in How to Change Your Mind. All of this points toward real therapeutic potential. But the research protocols that produce those results look a lot like traditional ceremonial structures. Careful preparation, a trained guide, deliberate setting, and extensive integration work afterward. The container, again, turns out to matter. The ancient practitioners appear to have understood something about the pharmacology that took modern science several decades of careful work to rediscover. The terrifying truth of this video's title is not that these plants are dangerous, though they can be in the wrong context. It's that the traditions built around them represent sophisticated epistemic systems that took generations to develop and can be dismantled in a single generation of inappropriate contact. We've done that more than once. The cost is not always immediately visible, but it is real. Go back to the shaman, the clay bowl, the 2 days without sleep, and the 1 drink taken with deliberate fear transmuted into ritual calm. What he has access to, in that altered state, in that specific cultural container, surrounded by those specific people who understand what is happening and why, is a mode of processing reality that ordinary waking consciousness cannot reach. The default mode network offline. The ordinary sense of a bounded, defended self temporarily set down. Whatever is on the other side of that boundary, whether you frame it as spiritual reality, as unconscious material, as suppressed trauma, as neurological noise reorganizing into signal, is available to him in a way it isn't available to most people in most moments of most days. What we know now, from clinical research that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago, is that this mode of processing has measurable therapeutic effects, that the experience of ego dissolution, properly prepared for and properly integrated, produces lasting changes in the brain's default mode network activity, lasting reductions in depression and anxiety scores, lasting shifts in what subjects describe as their relationship to death and to meaning. The ancient traditions were not practicing superstition. They were practicing something that worked, in a framework that was the only available framework for explaining why it worked. The terrifying truth isn't that these plants were used. It's that we spent most of the 20th century suppressing the traditions that knew how to use them safely, dismissing the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of generations as primitive irrationality, and then rediscovering the therapeutic potential through clinical trials that largely reinvent what the ancient traditions had already figured out, while the traditions themselves, disrupted and scattered by that same 20th century, grow harder and harder to recover. We didn't discover that plants can change minds. We always knew that. We forgot, for a while, that the change requires a container to be useful. The ancient practitioners never forgot. They built their whole world around it. Before 1000 goes where the real questions live. Underneath the comfortable version, past the sanitized history, into the actual mechanics of why things happened and what they cost and what they built. If that's the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribe and leave a comment with this. What do you think we've lost by pathologizing these traditions rather than understanding them? Because I think the list is longer and stranger than most people are willing to sit with, and I want to know if you agree.